Good morning, and thank you for coming to this session. My name is Chad Hansen. I will be chairing this session. We will be hearing from four, well, at least three fairly interesting speakers and myself. So we'll go ahead and get started here. The first speaker will be Anton from Grand Valley University.
Okay. Thank you very much, Chad. Okay, so the title of my paper originally was called Hotter Than and Cooler Than, and it's subsequently now it's been retitled to Heating Up and Cooling Down. And the paper is going to be coming out in the most recent edition of EAM, which should be, I've just told by Paul, it's in the mail. You can anticipate it shortly. I'm not going to give an overall summary of it. I thought what I would try to do is maybe give more key points and examples. So I have a little handout here, a one-page thing that I'm going to see how well we can pass. You want to pass those around. And I think one of the ways to sort of set this up is I think many people know the hot and cool concepts of McLuhan's understanding media are probably some of the most controversial and contested concepts in McLuhan. This paper was partly motivated, and I'm not going to name the person, but there's a pretty distinguished media ecological scholar who I had a haggle with some years ago who said, oh, that's the worst part of McLuhan. I teach around it. I don't even use that chapter. And it really sat sort of odd with me that it's hard for me to think of isolating McLuhan's understanding media to a single chapter. I see it as, although there is a chapter, Media Hot and Cold, it runs through the entire book. It has to do with the heat up and cooling down of comparative cultures, the differences of temperature, and admittedly, McLuhan himself did abandon the terms later in life, but I would argue that he did not abandon them because they weren't internally consistent with one another, or not that they weren't heuristic, but basically he could see that it was creating too much confusion, partly because the terms had reversed in meaning a couple of times during the time he thought of it and then said it, and then, I mean, the culture itself was flip-flopping back and forth, and that was creating, I think, some problems for him. Simplest way to say some of this, and what I am going to try, as I say, I'm going to try to talk about this key point that he, and I'm going to try to do the key points and then the examples. The first thing is that when McLuhan uses the term hot and cool, you do not want to think of it as like predicating a substance or identifying a particular medium as hot or cool. That's not his project. So simplest example would be take manuscripts. You say, are manuscripts hot or are they cool? You go, oh, that doesn't make any sense. It's hotter than the oral world, or the oral word, cooler than print. So for any medium, you want to say hotter than or cooler than. And then I'm going to even further say that it's part of the task is learning how to heat up and cool down. So it's always the hotter than, cooler than, and always context-based dependence of how are we going to compare this to what other medium, but then also what would be the particular strategies we want to use if we're going to say we're going to heat something up or cool something down. And so I'm really interested in what could be called temperature changes, and how could we understand them in terms of older media, in terms of environments, but I guess also, I think that if we really understand the terms and stick with them, they do give us some pretty predictive heuristic power for understanding some of the new media. So let me take the first example where I'm trying to talk about the issue of comparative. I think this is for many people the bugbear, the real haunter, and how they think McLuhan contradicts himself, and I think they're wrong. I think they're not carefully following text. So just for quick rehearsal, a hot medium is a medium that extends a single sense in high definition, fully completed package. Right? It's low in participation. Slow in participation. McLuhan also adds hot technologies are specialist and they have a tendency to detribalize. Basic characteristics of a hot media. Cool media, again comparatively, again we're speaking comparatively, are multi-sensory. They're open to participation, live time, and incompleted packages, largely to be filled in by the participants and the larger collectives. Now, radio becomes quite the problem for McLuhan in understanding media. At points, he claims very clearly that he says radio is a hot medium. Then he also says, wait, no, hot media are specialist and detribalized. Wait, no, hot media are the detribalizer, but he claims radio is the tribal drum. And this is where people go, oh, look at McLuhan. They throw the text down, they go, oh, he doesn't know what to do. He's contradicting himself. No, he is not. They are not carefully looking at all. What McLuhan says is that literacy in the West, particularly Europe and Americas, has given people a relative immunity to the effects of the heat of radio, so that they can enjoy radio as mere entertainment. The point is that print is a hot medium, radio is a hot medium, but print is hotter than radio by a long shot. That is, radio, even though it's a single sense, it's open to live-time collectivist participation in a way that the text is visual, it sits still, it's individuating, isolating, and there are many acoustical elements that can't be represented on the page, whereas radio conveys voice with lots of depth, emotion, forms of relation. So I do think simplest case would be then that radio can be defended. And we can say, for McLuhan, you can talk about radio as both hot and cool, depending on what you're comparing it to. And notice, for McLuhan, what he says is that the difficulty with radio is that as television is setting in, it's weakening people's immunity to the dogmatic echo chamber effects of radio. So the way that you balance off and try to stab off some of that tribalizing frenzy that radio brings is you have to go back to text, and you have to be careful not to let too much TV into your life, because that will also, again, it weakens the immunity. And so again, with this very simple discussion, you can see how McLuhan isn't talking about this medium's hot, this one's cool, this one's hot, and you try to chase down those effects. He's going, look, there are lots of different media forms that are correspondingly hotter than, cooler than others, and the war of cultures has to do with the comparative temperature differences in conflict and in contrast. That's really what this is about, I think, in so many ways. That's what McLuhan is concerned with, is the lots of different ways that, I guess, different temperatures set people at misalliance with one another. One of the ways I think to maybe help clarify this just a little bit here is on this question of how is a book hot? I think sometimes students, they say this, they say, how can a book be hot? It seems like it's very participative. It needs my interpretation. It seems like that's more participative. And I think that one of the ways to help beat students back on that is ask them, what is a phone book? A phone book is the exemplar of a hot medium for McLuhan. It does your thinking for you. Offers zero participation. You look up the name, it's alphabetically listed, there's the number. That's it. It's a hot medium, a phone book. It just typifies. It excludes the participation almost completely. Okay, so point two here, I might go down. About halfway. Point two is, and this is where I'm trying to suggest, okay, rather than just defend the position that I think McLuhan should have rightly defended, I don't think he had to abandon the terms. I think he could have been salvaged from a lot of the people who misunderstood him in their critiques. But what I would want to advocate is to keep the terms, and then rather than just define them, try to give a basic understanding for how to heat up or cool down. And so what I have here is a key point too, that any media form or environment can be heated up by decreasing the number of senses involved, increasing the definition of its content, completing its overall package for a single individual. You just basically do all of the opposite to what a cool down would have been, and so you heat it up. Then the cool down of any media form or environment would be by decreasing the number of senses. By increasing the number of senses, reducing the definition of its content, and then opening the process to increased live-time, multiple-person participations. So let's take television there as an example. TV, we all say, TV is, for McLuhan, the typically cool medium. And it has to do with the seasonality, the shows come in episodes, it's more like a cartoon, it's scripted in certain ways that allow for shaggy figures. Again, it's very low definition. There's lots of different ways in which he identifies it as cool. But I think what we could say is you can heat up, bless you, you can heat up television quite a bit. First, you get a high-definition TV. Next, you set it in the front of the room and you get row seating and you dim the lights, you make everyone be quiet from the entire, and you watch only Netflix movies on your TV and you play them start to end, telling everybody to shut up in the row seating with the lights dark. At that point, you significantly heated up the television experience. Now, not completely. There still are a lot of these, it's multi-sensory, but you can see that environment is a much hotter form than let's sit around and eat popcorn and chit-chat and the commercials are coming on and people are going and they're trying to keep up with the latest installment of some show that they're watching. Somebody yesterday, Barry Backer, I was walking around and he said, so you're doing this hot cold thing, can you say something about it? And he said, what about selfies? These selfie cell phones, what are those, hotter or cooler? I thought, okay, let's get at that. Okay, so a selfie. I would say in some way, yes, a selfie is much hotter. It's a hotter form of photography. That is, it's isolating. Instead of, I go, and can you take my picture? And then I stand, and then you take the picture, and I go, let me see it. Oh, no, shoot, you take another one. We do this. This is very cool, very participative. Now I have to stand, I go, shh, bang, and I look, and I'm like, okay. And it's very isolated, it's very high definition, and again, it's a heating up of photography, even though photography is already a hot medium. It's a high definition medium. Take Skype. Phone calls. Phone call, McLuhan says, is cooler than radio. Why? Because it's multi-sensory. For McLuhan, the voice is a sense. So whereas the radio is only ear, voice introduces a multi-sensory dynamic. And so if you go to Skype then, you can see it. Skype is so much cooler than a phone. Sometimes Skype is a group affair. You got the tables, it's Thanksgiving, you got one table up to another, they got a Skype wall there, and it's like a whole family sort of reacting, and you don't really have the privacy that you used to have with the phone. Like, you always feel like other people are overhearing your Skypes. Like your parents are chiming in on stuff, or relatives and roommates, right? So take a computer, right? You have your computer, and you're sitting there working on something online, and then the wireless goes out, and the computer shrinks down to its sort of detethered state. Well, what you just had is a heating up of your computer. The computer just heated up right there. Now, somebody said, well, some of this came from Bernie Hogan. Bernie Hogan, I saw him talk at ICA some years ago, and he was really critical of the internet. He was going, oh, the internet's not a medium. You can't really say whether the internet is hot or cool. I thought, well, kind of yes and no. Compared to what? In what context? And I was thinking, well, yeah, there's a lot of packages on the internet that are very hot. Oh, they're very hot. That's why I think we want to be very careful about suggesting that the internet is global village, if by that we mean increasingly tribal. It may be proliferating as much new forms of internal heat, of siloing individuals, as much as it's bringing people together. I think it's why Sherry Turkle's stuff on Alone Together is so insightful. Right? It is getting at that tension that's, I think, undergirding a lot of these new media. Let me say, I guess, sort of wrap this up by saying, I think part of my interest in this comes from a much larger, and I'm excited to see this come out, but it comes from a much larger project on what is literacy exactly. And I thought I would share an example of how to maybe understand literacy. And it's bouncing off the session we were just in on the importance of paper science and how, paper itself grew hotter and hotter through history. It was irregular size and depths, and there wasn't standardization. There wasn't an 8.5 by 11 press, stuff like this, right? The paper itself became more and more uniform, more and more standardized, right? More and more specialist. And I think if you imagine how paper science is related to literacy, you can see why McLuhan then talks about paper routes and roads. That the same thing that happened to paper science happened to roads. We just don't think about it that way. It's a dirt, dusty trail. There's a lot of participation. That's a cool thing. You're bobbling around. It's all over like this. Then you get to today's interstate highway. These things are paved super smooth. They allow for rapid transverse over them with very little participation and involvement. They're super hot. And, sorry, a minute and a half. On that, I got a Subaru all-wheel drive. It's a couple days before I came here. I'm driving the Subaru all-wheel drive, and boom, tire blows out. There's a hook over there in Grand Haven. Takes out my tire, called AAA, blah, blah, blah. The guy comes, and he says, oh, boy, that's a fancy tire. There's difficulty replacing this one. And he says, well, he goes, go up to Bell Tires, up in Mesquite. I was not going to go up to Bell Tires. They say, oh, actually, we have records of the fact that you bought this set of tires, 2 years ago, and they looked at my odometer, and they found that only 20,000 miles elapsed, and this was crucial for them. They needed to know what the odometer reading was. Then they brought out a very specific tire gauge tool. Thing was, to the little micro thread. They went in there and they started weighing the tires because they had to show that there's a limit of its odometer, it's very literal, of this many miles, and then how much thread is left, because they couldn't sell me just one tire if it wouldn't be in legal accordance with the tread wear, basically showing that these tires have to be absolutely hot. I mean, they are uniform, standardized like no tomorrow in order to fit on today's roads. So I think a lot of people, they think more about literacy. It's not about pen and paper. Your world has been made over in a lot of hot technologies. Okay, thanks.
All right, our second speaker today will be Anton Chrystall, Senior Lecturer in Communications at Massey University.
That was awesome. Actually awesome. It's also terrifying to actually follow someone like Corey. In my humble opinion, I think he's one of our most eloquent and refined minds in the MEA, and so it's actually quite an honour to just speak in the same panel. Okay, so the first thing, I guess it all has to begin with thanks, right? And so I'm thankful, grateful to the United States, to Denver, Colorado. I found this city to be amazing, to be hospitable and a considered state. And also thank the Meteorology Association. As part of that, I also need to offer some caveats. Basically, I just lumped some shit together so I can come here and listen. Unfortunately, I am not delivering to you a great work from a fine mind. I'm delivering to you a ticket to ride. The only punchline that you may get from this is maybe a slightly nuanced repositioning of McLuhan. Okay, so it comes out of a lot of my work from the archives. So I want to talk about McLuhan's study of advertising. I could articulate this in terms of scholarly norms, but this is essentially would include my real concerns, which is they're not hagiographic. It's about a simple story about a life of a man who I followed through the archives, and I'm interested in what he says about advertising, the way he talks about advertising. It's more at the level of method. Like almost everything McLuhan has to say about advertising these days is completely obsolete. It's a waste of time. And so when we're going through this material, the question at hand for the live mind today is a question of translation and transposition. Okay, so while claiming that McLuhan's work on advertising has been obsolete, I do have to mention there is a figure, Douglas B. Holt, who's the author of How Brands Become Icons. He's a big A-star, Harvard Business Review kind of guy. And he's just rolling out McLuhan from the 60s, unacknowledged, and he's getting a very big reputation for his work. So in one sense, there is, for an audience sort of resolutely stuck in the 19th century, McLuhan is still relevant in a very direct and literal way. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to just offer an abridged survey of McLuhan's study of advertising from about the mid-1930s all the way up into his death. The interesting thing, I guess, for some of you is listening to some of the stuff that came prior to the Mechanical Bride, which is, in my humble opinion, the aspect of McLuhan that is not talked to, and I think is pretty damn interesting. Okay, so he begins, like most of us, as a teacher in the university system, and like in the mid-30s he brings advertising into the US classroom, and in one sense it's pioneering relative to the North American scene. In another sense, however, he's working out his depths to Levis and I guess the late radical models. To the degree that we can talk about his motivations, I guess the early McLuhan's motivations for studying advertising or pop culture is essentially pedagogic and professional. It's economic, it's convenient, and it serves as a ready-hand way of, I guess, meeting his students where they're at, in the practice of the rhetor, as it were. And it's also an alibi to study the one object, which is life itself. However, when we coming into the mechanical bride phase, like he starts working on this thing in the early 40s, and there's a number of book-length manuscripts that are worth paying attention to. And in these fragments that eventually became the bride, we see his motivations change, and they become actually overtly and primarily political. So in his writings of the 1940s, which is the sort of background to the bride, McLuhan documents a massive shift in the nature of power and governance, or what we might call here like a social control algorithm. He documents a shift from control of humans' appetites, top-down power, to control through their appetites, which is sort of a bottom-up power, orchestrated by way of a magical shift to the center of the poetical process. And so his real concern here is how creative types or artists who had formerly been sort of cast adrift by Western society had become radically reintegrated into the, I guess, the burgeoning corporate enterprise in the early 20s. And in their new roles, they effectively became the custodians of values, priests of culture, and I guess this is due in part to the default of philosophy and religion. So these new class of commercial artists, McLuhan saw, were creating psychological machines that were working at sub-rational levels of emotion. They were helping transferring advertising into a manufacturer's weapon for gaining control of the market. This, in turn, McLuhan noted, meant taking control of politics and the social ends of the whole society. In short, McLuhan saw the rise of advertising in the early 20th century as indicative of something of an invisible revolution and constitution of a new world order of direct social control via cybernetics, ostensibly designed with the express purpose of producing effects for the total economy, but without any increase in human awareness. When considered alongside his comments that presage those of the post-humanists that are made several decades later, any notion that McLuhan's vision grew darker in later life can now, with a blush, safely retire. By the mid-40s, McLuhan's in the Terminator land, and he's laughing at Orwell as talking about something that went on 50 years before he even wrote it. Okay, so I guess he elucidates some of his concerns in terms of setting advertising in relationship to politics and advertising in relationship to war. I'm going to go into those. This political thing, I'll just slot this in as a little digression. It's you do know that understanding media was going to be called understanding media and politics. Okay, so this is something which is often not actually really well considered. McLuhan's a deeply political guy from start to finish. And just as a second digression, as I guess the fundamental discovery that McLuhan makes in the 1940s, which I guess shapes and informs the entire career, is that he becomes aware that people are not paying attention to media. That's his biggest discovery. It's nothing about extensions or this, that, and the other thing. He discovered that media are operating as something like a black hole. And I guess he's working out of physics to discuss, what happens beyond the event horizon. Anyway, so now we get into sort of late 40s, and he claims that creative political activity today constitutes studying paradigms advertising as an educational program directed at self-knowledge and self-criticism. And so he sets about this task like using the education curriculum provided by ad people and bringing it into the class and then taking it to a wider audience in terms of through his books. He notes he's not interested in trying to rouse sales resistance, nor is he trying to anathematize advertisers or marketers. Rather, his concerns are the public and or audience and of the advertising enterprise. And so the stated goal of this early manuscript, Typhon in America, is essentially to promote the necessary moral and intellectual regeneration necessary in the audience and the publics of advertising to precede any improvement. And in his early work, he's actually very explicit that he's optimistic there's a possible positive outcome, and that is, should the energy that animates the ad man be transformed to the world of political speculation and creation, America could still fill some of its broken utopian promises. Like, that's an interesting thing that hasn't really been said before. American promises. Yeah. McLuhan's kind of pro-American. And I think his early words actually, as I've been walking around Denver these last couple of days, I think they resonate deeply with your time. Your country needs some considered attention. There are interesting things on your horizon. I digress. So, how am I doing for time? Six minutes. That's ample. Very excited about ample. So McLuhan was faced with this breakdown like in the late 40s and early 50s, and we often hear this horse shit like, oh, McLuhan became moral, and that's where it is, and that's where it stops. Crap. Okay, so there's three basic issues. One, he has a freak out that he's something of an imposter, and he goes he's basically like, I don't know a whole lot of stuff. He calls it in terms of his innocence, in terms of an intellectual shortcomings, apropos vertical and horizontal symbolists, the particular societies, organizations, and structures which he believed were implicated in those things. Big one, he realizes the mechanical bride is a symptom and a knee-jerk response or reaction to the environment of the day. He goes, the media environment wrote that book, not me, and I am just merely, it's sort of the sex organ of the literary landscape. That's a heavy thing to discover, that your own work is a symptom, eh? The next one, number 3, he discovers there's no audience. How's this? You're writing to Pound, and you would have seen this in the letters. No college, business, or city is run by a human person anymore. I have yet to meet someone who knows what they are doing, let alone why. Abdication of the human motive is now plain. How to tackle the situation of the zombie and sleepwalkers. You cannot argue. They agree and move on. There is no more disagreement. He's writing for like a post-human situation, and he makes this explicit in Letter to Kenneth, like reflecting on the bride. The mechanical bride is something that happened before the flood. It assumed an audience. It is a wedding announcement found 1,000 years from now on a block of concrete. Which is, again, I had a little giggle as I was walking around Denver. So Morpheus in the underworld. What happens next? So in 1955, he ditches all that stuff. He actually starts basically an ideas agency, which is like a prototype type Saatchi and Saatchi's as it's become. He actually goes and tries to sell a whole lot of really, really crazy shit to people. He drops the head-on assault. He realizes it's counterproductive, that it's pointless, that expressions of disapproval essentially are futile, and they give power and authority to that which is condemned. So he's not going after advertisers anymore. He's not going to how would you say, attack head on. Plus, to sort of do so is exclude some of the service that he saw in the advertising world. Advertising was an education. Advertising was actually holding a country together that would otherwise dissolve in anarchy. It was a common experience. And, I mean, just for shits and giggles, it was a thorn in the side of the Puritans, right? And McLuhan was constantly at war with the New England mind, so I guess he got some kicks out of that. He also realized that there's limits of the book. You'll notice that there's a second book that McLuhan does, which is called Culture of Our Business. It does not talk to television advertising. It talks to the effects of television advertising on the print. So in and around this period of the 50s, McLuhan makes a very clinical, systematic assessment of what are the limits of prose. And from there on in, he will work within those limits. And it's an interesting thing to pay attention to. He also jettisoned accepted categories and categorical distinctions. So he has something of an epistemological crisis as well, because he comes across this word advertising and he's going, hold on a second, this word actually comes from the environment that I am in and I cannot be separated from. And so he actually brackets this as completely suspect and steps back out. And then I guess he adopts a new style. And some of these things we could develop at length, but it's pretty interesting. But like basically his new strategy, and he says it quite closely, it's here. See, we live in their unconscious age. And if people go unconscious, we can only reach them through the unconscious. An inevitable fact of dealing people in a trance is that you have to talk to them in the language of dreams. And this is what I wanted to bring to media ecology, because as media ecology becomes more of a discipline and we practice writing to one another about idea X, idea Y, whatever, I think media ecology, as McLuhan practiced it, is a distinctly outward-looking, you could say Pauline enterprise, and that does seek to go into the dark, to meet the people where they are at, and to talk to them in their language of dreams. And we had an interesting adventure last night where we actually saw the kind of people that we had to talk to. And it was fucking off the hook. Okay, that's the environment that we've got to go and talk to. Okay, so blah, blah, blah. Basically, McLuhan, he looks at, like in his later work, he looks at advertising through the lens of education, art, myth, magic, liturgy, ritual, economics, politics, and war. Okay, so all of these he sets up like four-part analogical structures which enable them to be, worked through like circuits. And then he looks at some of the dynamics, I guess what you call it, the dynamic transformations within those systems. But that's, I guess, poetry. And in and through that, he comes to, I guess, reveal a ground. But I'll just stop there, actually, and I'll write this as a paper. Thank you very much for having me here.
Yeah.
Thank you for putting up with my.
Our next speaker will be Robert Riordan, University of Chicago.
All right, so I too greatly honored to be up here with Corey and Andrew and Chad, and none of these guys are an easy act to follow. So my initial excitement turned to terror when I realized that. But so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the concept of revelation and kind of how that relates to McLuhan's idea of the medium as the message. The first time I got into media studies at all, I was in Barry Liss's class at the UWMC, which is a little ragtag group of scoundrels in central Wisconsin, and he taught us. He'd give us these segments of text, little bits of McLuhan, and we'd read them, and I totally misunderstood the medium as the message. And then I left and went to St. Olaf College before I got to figure it all out. And after my first year at St. Olaf College and my first year with Kierkegaard, I was reading, it was in the summer, and I was with a group of what we called young scholars, and we were reading Philosophical Fragments, one of Kierkegaard's more famous works. And I was trying to make sense of the author, Johannes Climacus, right, his pseudonymous author, his idea that the teacher, Jesus in this case, right, has to be in an essential relationship to revelation, which is not how communication and teaching works in a normal way. We're usually in an accidental relationship to it, right? So, as I was reading this, I kind of like, it just hit me. I said, oh wait, the medium is the message. No, I got McLuhan wrong there, and I got Kierkegaard wrong there. But I scribbled it in the front of my book. I have my book in my briefcase. It's medium equals message written on the cover page. So then I did a lot more work with Kierkegaard while I was there, and then I got to the University of Chicago, and I got to study there under a guy named Jean-Luc Marion, who's a famous French philosopher. He recently delivered the Gifford Lectures on Revelation, and I got to take a course with him on Revelation there that was kind of the predecessor to that. So Revelation keeps kind of popping up, and every time it does, I keep kind of going back to this medium as the message thing and kind of putting it on there and seeing how it works. And I'm going to kind of share some of that with you guys and kind of what's gone on with my mind in the last 3 years on that, and kind of put it back together here for this presentation. So what I'm going to try and do is kind of sketch out the pictures of Revelation offered by Kierkegaard and by Marion, and then kind of talk about how they relate. Trying to keep it kind of within the time frame. I'm not going to go too much into textual references, but if you have any questions on where anything comes from, I can point those out to you pretty well. Before getting any further, it might be worthwhile to distinguish between what might be ordinary understandings of how Revelation works and is structured. We can break it down in as many artificial ways as we want, but there's probably 4 pieces that need to be identified when we talk about Revelation. We need to talk about the revealer, the person doing the revelation, what's being revealed, the medium of revelation, how it's being communicated, and the recipient of the revelation and what's going on with that individual. If we looked at, say, an American Reformed or Calvinist theology, we might come up with something like the idea that the revelation is a propositional or systematic understanding of Scripture. The medium of communication might be the Word itself, the Bible, or some reference to something like the Holy Spirit. If we looked at maybe an American Catholic understanding of Revelation, what we'll probably end up with is something more like a broader focus on both tradition, the church itself, and Scripture. And possibly even something like involvement in the sacraments. And so the medium itself becomes more of the human experience going through religion than the Word itself. And if we looked at, say, a Lutheran tradition, we'd probably find something kind of in the middle. A focus on Scripture, not as a systematic propositional understanding, but as an object that is present before human subjectivity. So Revelation only exists in the context of this book and the human subject. Luther himself put it in his, I think it was his table talks, I am not so certain of the grace which I see in miracles shown to others as when I have before me plain and clear words. So what he's saying there is that it's not miracles that convince him of the truth of what he's doing. It's actually just the experience of reading the Word and how that affects him and changes him and moves him. When it comes to McLuhan's understanding of Revelation, luckily I don't have to guess at it too much. He gives us a pretty good outline in the medium and the light. In a conversation there with Peter Babin, he says, in Jesus Christ there's no distance or separation between the medium and the message. This is the one case where we can say that the medium and the message are fully one and the same. So here McLuhan will use the notion of content to distinguish from message. He'll refer to the words or teachings of the Bible as the content of Revelation. And he says, isn't the real message of the church in the secondary or side effects of the incarnation? That is to say, in Christ's penetration into all of human existence. In another passage, he refers to the content as everybody who reads the Bible, while he distinguishes the message as the effect it has on us, conversion. So we can say that the message only actually exists for the people who are converting, who are actually kind of tuned in to what's going on there. Now, it may be that McLuhan's identifying Jesus as living out the Christian life, and he says that the meaning of the message are absolutely one and the same in this context. He may be onto something else. I really haven't been able to figure it out. I'm sure maybe some of you guys could help me with that one. But he's not the first kind of enigmatic thinker I've tangled with, so I'm going to move on to Kierkegaard here. So, my primary sources for Kierkegaard's view of Revelation are philosophical fragments and Practicing Christianity. Practicing Christianity is written 6 years later under a different pseudonym, Anti-Climacus. Philosophical fragments are written by Climacus. A lot of people take this to mean that they're in opposition to each other. That's actually not how he uses anti. He actually means like above or before. So Anti-Climacus is the more authoritative. And the primary difference between the two texts, aside from their style and some of the content, at least as far as they present Revelation, is going to be the dependence on what he calls the condition and the moment in philosophical fragments. They play a big part in how an individual receives Revelation, but they don't actually, it's a little bit of metaphysical hocus pocus going on. When you get to Practicing Christianity, they're gone. So in philosophical fragments, Johannes Climacus defines the condition as the possibility of learning the truth from God. This possibility or the condition is given by the God, and then the moment that individual receives it is termed the moment. The thing here is that in Practicing Christianity, he's focused on how can knowledge of a historical event be transformative in a way to provide for salvation. So instead of having the knowledge itself be transformative, he's having a transformative act on the part of the God in order to deliver the revelation. In Practicing Christianity, where the term doesn't appear at all, the learner comes to the truth by imitating Christ. In each text, the content of the revelation is the presence of God in the human form. The content is the union of God and man, and the infinitely different in Christ. As such, the teaching or content presents itself as a paradox. It cannot even be conceptualized. In practice, encountering the paradox is described as entering into the possibility of the offense, since it is offensive to or in opposition to reason. Anti-Climacus writes, the possibility of the offense is at the crossroads, or it is like standing at the crossroad. From the possibility of the offense, one turns either to offense or to faith, but one never comes to faith except from the possibility of the offense. In this case, the offense rises in the encounter with Christ, and upon arriving at that paradox, the individual must choose how to respond. Respond either in faith or by entering into the offense. If we looked at McLuhan's kind of comments on this, he talks, he kind of rails against the Pharisees and calls them the conceptualizers. So if you try and make sense of this God-man union, you're gonna stumble short. but you're gonna fall into offense. You won't be able to receive the revelation. But if you don't try to, if you come to it through the experience of imitating Christ, you can have it in a different way of understanding. So this is what he says about the imitation of Christ. Knowing the truth is something that entirely of itself accompanies being the truth. Being of the truth is the redoubling of truth within yourself, within me, within him, that your life, my life, his life expresses the truth approximately in the striving for it. Just as the truth was in Christ, a life, for he was the truth. So, what can we say with the structure of Revelation for Kierkegaard? The revealer is Christ. He's also the medium of the communication. It is his lived out life that is, both the medium and the message itself there. But it becomes the message to us when we imitate that in our own lives. The message is precisely life. It's not accessible to knowledge the way that, say, a propositional understanding of Scripture is. This is one of the things that is the reason that Kierkegaard says that it's an essential relationship. You take out Jesus, this truth doesn't exist anymore. So instead, it's only accessible by redoubling this life in your own. So this imitating and redoubling then is the message that we're talking about. It's the impact it has on our lives, which is perfectly compatible with what McLuhan actually said, right? It's in the individual human life. Those who receive the revelation enter into faith. Those who reject the revelation enter into the state of offense. If we wanted to kind of point out what might be the content, we'd probably look at something like a narrative account of Jesus' life, like something we find in the Gospels. So then I'm going to kind of turn a little bit here and I'm going to look at Jean-Luc Marion's. I'm going to get I'll try and kind of keep it together here for this one. Marion's hard enough to understand when you're sitting in front of him. It's even harder to kind of go ahead and repeat that. So I'll probably rely on my notes here a little bit more heavily than I have been up to now. So in this model of revelation, there's a particular structure. In fact, it's characterized by the structure that he defines. First, revelation begins with something that's invisible or unseen. The revelation of these things become visible, and they're revealed. Second, revelation or apocalypsis implies a crisis. The uncovering of whatever was hidden has an impact on the spectator. It's the introduction of a new interpretive system. It's not the addition of new information or the rectification of a mistake. Third, revelation involves a choice on the part of the spectator. They must choose to accept or reject the revelation. And fourth, and this one's kind of the core of revelation, the reciprocal relation in revelation. Or the reciprocal relation in revelation. Something is revealed to the witness, and as a result, something is revealed about the witness. In revelation, the status of the spectator is changed. They either both accept revelation and become a witness, or if we were using Kierkegaard's, we'd say faith, or if we were talking about McLuhan, we'd say they convert. Or in rejecting the revelation, they're in some way judged. So they either enter into the state of the offense, or they just don't get it. A list of those features would be something like, 1, revelation begins with something that is not seen but becomes visible. It's the introduction of a new interpretive system for number 2. Number 3, it forces a choice on the spectator. It's the kind of thing that when you're confronted with it, you can't not have an opinion. You got to go one way or the other. And fourth, that opinion reveals something about the spectator. Their status is changed. So when we look at Kierkegaard and philosophical fragments, and he's trying to make this this change happen in the individual for salvation purposes, this is something that Marion's probably not going to be concerned with. But what we could say is that it's not so much a physical change, you're changing your relationship to something that's out there, that wasn't there for you before. So forever, that's kind of be a relationship that you're in, whether or not it's metaphysical or whether or not it's just an epistemological situation. So here we see a very similar structure to the pictures painted by McLuhan and Kierkegaard. It has some striking differences. First, this particular model does not itself pick out what's being revealed. For this purposes, I'm actually going to refer to passages of Scripture. Practicing Christianity follows the Matthew narrative. If you look at the way the chapters are written out, it's the Thanksgiving prayer in Matthew. So that's actually what I'll refer to when I get to that. But what we could probably safely say is what becomes visible is the content of the revelation. But the message is both the new interpretive system that's taken on by the spectator, as well as what's revealed about the spectator. Those are both elements that only emerge in the interaction. In the case of the individual that rejects revelation, we could limit the message to the judgment against him. In the word, the word judgment in this context might imply too much. It might be more right to think about it as a relationship. But for Kierkegaard, we describe the two possibilities as faith and being offended. So the Thanksgiving prayer in Matthew says that at that time Jesus said, "I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you've hidden these things from me from the wise and intelligent and have revealed them to infants. Yes, Father, for such was your gracious will. All these have been handed over to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. Come to me, all that you are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So this passage actually does identify two revelations. The revelation to Jesus of his mission, or that he's the Son of God, or both. And then the revelation to the infants that's withheld from the Pharisees.
2 minutes, Robert.
Thank you. The identification of the revelation to Jesus is found there in verse 27. All things have been handed over to me by my Father. It also highlights the reciprocal character of revelation by establishing Jesus in a reciprocal relationship of cognition, reciprocal cognition with God the Father. No one knows the Son except the Father, no one knows the Father except the Son. This fits with our model of revelation. It's reciprocal and it transforms Jesus' experience. Either he receives his mission as the Son of God, or he receives both the knowledge of his identity and then his mission. But that's changing his experience on earth. In either case, the revelation transforms his experience. Verse 27 establishes the second revelation, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. This suggests that Jesus is responsible for revealing the Father. Alongside verses 28 and 30, we can see that this suggests a manifold content of the revelation. That Jesus is both the Son of God as well as his teachings. Verse 25 reads, "You have hidden these things from the wise and intelligent and revealed them to infants." The wise and intelligent is obviously a reference to Pharisees, as is the conversation about yokes. While the infants refers to common people and Jesus' own disciples. Interestingly enough, McLuhan calls the scribes and Pharisees conceptualizers, and as such, they are unable to receive the message of revelation. If we look at this notion in Kierkegaard's work, we could say that conceptualization of the revelation is impossible, because the revelation involves a paradox, namely that a specific man is God. And so anytime conceptualization happens, it causes you to stumble into the offense. The second revelation of the Thanksgiving prayer, also features a revelation as conceived by Professor Marion, something that was not known as made visible. Jesus' identity as the Son of God, God's divine being, and Jesus as the Messiah, and knowledge of God the Father through Jesus' teachings. This also has an impact on the spectator. In accepting Jesus' teachings, they will be given rest. The language of division demonstrates the revelation reveals something about the spectators. Common people receive the revelation, while the Pharisees and the intellectuals are denied it, and so they face judgment on that ground. But what we see from each of these conceptions of revelation is that what's important in each case is the experience of the spectator. In every case, we could say that the spectator is conceived as the message. With Kierkegaard and McLuhan, it's clear that Jesus is conceived as the medium. It's not entirely clear with Marion, though we might be able to point to that it is a logical conclusion given the particularities of the division between those who accept and reject the revelation. But ultimately, I think there's a lot more to be gleaned from this. This is just kind of where I was at right now. I hope that I think it was a good place to start.
Housekeeping here first. Probably just a nervous sweat. Let me start with that. Walk slowly so we use up as much of my time as I can. Because it is extremely intimidating to be up here, particularly following such good speakers. And since I have actually heard all three of these speakers talk right now, I think I speak with more authority than anyone, although I'm the third person to say this is extremely intimidating to follow such good speakers. And it's intimidating for me in general because I'm just not an outgoing person. I'm reclusive, and it's hard for me to get up in front of people and talk. Of course, I do teach, and so I decided that if I just view you as a group of students who are naked, then probably, hopefully we'll relax a little bit. At any rate, I feel that I'm here with the least qualifications of anyone because I've only recently, in a sense, discovered or actually been turned on to Marshall McLuhan and his works. I happened to meet my cousin Valerie a few years ago at a family reunion, and she had this weird guy hanging out with her that I clicked with. We clicked in, and Corey introduced me, or in a sense, goaded me into getting into the ideas of Marshall McLuhan, and as a matter of fact, turned me on to Ong, and Ong's text was especially enlightening for me. My field is the history of ideas, and what I've been doing for the last 40 years basically is try to accumulate as much information, at least, if not understanding, as I could about all the documentation that human beings have produced in the last 50,000 years. Excuse me. And so I basically set about doing that. At the same time, I developed a sort of a method of ensuring that I don't get led astray too easily by just basically deciding to read text only of people who are no longer living alongside. And because of that, this was in the 1970s when I was a young man, and Marshall McLuhan was still alive, and so I was basically, just not interested in those kind of things. I was, at the same time, I was interested in physics, and it's kind of hard to stay up on the most modern physics when you're reading dead people, and so I did read some living people, but in terms of philosophy and the things that I was interested in for the most part, I decided to attack the texts that were accepted as at least authorities in the field. And because of that, I was mostly, as I say, ignorant of Marshall McLuhan and his ideas and his work until the last few years. But as soon as I saw what was there, I did embrace it because it sort of corroborated the work that I had been doing in the history of ideas. In particular, probably about 15 years ago or so, I realized that I had to organize the data. I mean, because collecting as much data as you can over 50,000 years of human beings producing documents, and starting, of course, with cave paintings and plastic art and things like that, but eventually leading to mythology and those types of ideas. You have to have clearly some way to organize the information and organize the data. And so I started thinking about it, and I realized that there was basically two general approaches to understanding or to making your way in the world, if you will, and basically what we would call developing worldviews. Excuse me. Actually, this is not a new idea, because in the history of philosophy, people have talked about the period of, for instance, Socrates and Confucius and the transitional period or the things that were taking place at that time. As a matter of fact, much of what I'm talking about here begins with a book, a German text. I believe it's from the 1920s and 30s, and I do not remember the author's name at this time. The text is Vom Mythos Logos, from Mythos to Logos. Basically talking about the transition in the type of language, or the type of grammar, as I prefer to call it, the use of grammar in ways of understanding the world. And that became the first point of distinction for me in these, in basically classifying or categorizing all of this information in terms of the history of ideas. Basically, it was a type of grammar, or a form of grammar. Excuse me. And what I realized basically is that, and this is what basically the text says, that at about 600 years before Christ, with the emergence of science, which comes first in Greece, there's a development, in a sense, a turning away from the mythological and figurative language of the oralist tradition, and trying to develop a literal, logical, or logical language, hence the word logos, language of the Greek intellectuals and philosophers, the scientists and philosophers. Excuse me. And so in organizing this data, I came up with the idea that basically there are two general forms of worldview. The ones that employ a richly figurative language, which these historians have been calling for almost 100 years now, mythos, as opposed to narratives that tend to shy away from the figuratively rich language and focus in on a more literal language to basically disambiguate, in a sense, and try to focus our attention. And so basically I see these two general worldviews as developing in the world, but first, of course, starting perhaps 50,000 years ago, certainly I think 30,000 years ago, the narratives, we start to develop the narratives that we call the traditional mythological or religious narratives about how the world comes into existence and how it works in general. And there are certain characteristics that this worldview has because of this figuratively rich language. Then, with the emergence of science, it begins with, of course, Thales, Miletus in Greece. With the emergence of science, he intentionally turns away from the mythological descriptions of how the world works and wants to come up with a more rational and basically natural. Of course, they coin the word nature. Of course, it's the Greek word physis, that becomes nature, translated by the Latins. But it's the beginning of trying to understand the world not so much in the figurative aspect, but in the sense of a literal approach. Excuse me. I wish I had a glass of water. I'm getting a little parched. But anyway, so I see these two general worldviews, one which begins about 30,000 years ago, and basically it takes its form because we know pretty much nothing, nothing about the world. And so, as John Battista Vico points out, and I like to use his term, we are given to the personification of things so that we can basically explain them to ourselves. Because, of course, back 30,000 years ago, we know very little about how things work other than persons or human beings. We know how to keep ourselves alive. We know how to make more of ourselves. And so we tend to express our understanding of how the world works or what's going on in the world in terms of personification. Excuse me. And so, notes here. The first distinction I make in these two worldviews is in terms of, as I said, their grammar, mythos and logos. And when I was introduced by Corey to the ideas of Marshall McLuhan, particularly the ideas of how technological changes will produce changes in culture, I started seeing that, or started realizing that the reason that, in part anyway, the Greeks are starting to go down this more literal and rational path is in part because of the changes that Marshall McLuhan is talking about. In particular, of course, the introduction of writing to begin with. Now, I do want to point out that the advent of writing, which is about 3,000, maybe a little bit more, actually could even be 4,000 years before Christ, depending on if we're taking in the cylinder seals and the Sumerian cylinder seals and things like that. But in general, it occurs at about the same time as our discovery of the smelting of metals. And so there are not only intellectual changes taking place, but of course there are technological changes taking place. And then the second change, of course, with respect to writing, and I don't really, I'm still learning much about McLuhan. I don't know how much he stresses the difference between the earliest forms of writing, for instance, in terms of the hieroglyphics and stuff like that. But clearly it is with the advent of the alphabet itself that changes the human psyche more than just, in a sense, just the advent of writing. And that occurs at about the same time as the discovery of processes for smelting iron. And so, again, these changes, which I think are merely serendipitous in terms of their coming together, are happening at similar times. And what they're producing is opportunities, I think, for looking at the world in different ways. So, what I want to do quickly here, I'm already running out of time there, and I really haven't gotten to my point, but what I want to do is just give you the characteristics quickly of the two different types of worldview. Now, I'm not talking about, for instance, a worldview in the sense of the Christian worldview, but a worldview in the sense of a sort of figuratively expressed worldview, which I take most religions to be, as opposed to worldview in terms of a literal expression of how you understand the world, which I take to be scientific. So again, it begins with a distinction between the use of grammar, the mythos and logos. And mythos is, again, figuratively rich use of the figures of speech, such as metonymy or metonymic figures of speech, such as synecdoche and things like that, or what I call analogic figures of speech. I know the traditional terms are metonymy and metaphor, but I was taught that a metaphor is an implicit simile. Of course, at the same time, a simile is an explicit metaphor, which doesn't make sense to me. So, as far as I'm concerned, a simile is an explicit analogy, and a metaphor is an implicit analogy. And so they're both forms of analogy. And so for me, the two master tropes are metonymy and analogy, which basically allows for, the expression of simile and metaphor and irony and different types of analogic expressions. So we have a figuratively rich language. I do want to give you an example, if I have that in here, of the use of what I mean by this figuratively rich language. This is a particular honorific that I read about, and I think it illustrates the point nicely. It's basically it's an honorific used by a young man to speak to another male older than him, basically who is his uncle. Right? And the basic word they use in the metaphorical expression is, metaphorical meaning in a sense figurative, is the word chief. Right? And so the basic idea is that this is a very important person, he's a chief. And then they will prefix that particle with a word that means great. So it's a great chief. But then they will suffix it with, put a suffix on it with something that will mean something like of little stature. Right? So he's a great chief of little stature. And really, I mean, we would say, yes, uncle, whatever you want. And that's, I think that's the same attitude that they have. It's just that the way they have of talking about that particular person is different from the way that we typically talk about him these days in a more literal sense. As a matter of fact, most of us don't even know what the word uncle means originally. So. According to, of course, James George Fraser, this figuratively rich language leads to what he calls a misunderstanding. In other words, these people tend to believe that the way they speak about the world is the way the world really works. And so they develop ideas in order to allow them to understand and manipulate the world based on this figuratively rich language. And so we come to the advent of what Fraser calls sympathetic magic. Two forms, imitative and contagious magic. Flipping back and forth here. Imitative magic is based on analogy, of course. If I make a voodoo doll, it is analogous to the person or the thing that I'm trying to manipulate in the world. And so by understanding the connection between things in terms of analogy, I can manipulate the world in terms of analogy. Contagious magic is based on the misunderstanding of metonymy and metonymic figures of speech. If I say my brother is a hired hand, none of you will think that my brother is just a hand. But with these people talking in this way, the oral is talking in this way, they tend to think that this is the way the world works. And so if something is connected to something else and then is removed to a great distance, there's still a connection between them. And so if I destroy your hair or your fingernail clippings, for instance, I can destroy you. Right? And so from the figurative language, or from the grammar in a sense, there develops a set of methods for understanding and manipulating the world. I think coincidentally, at the same time, religion comes into existence, takes all of this under its wing, basically takes all this information from the magicians, using this way of talking, and develops a worldview in general about what we would call the mythological expression of our understanding of how the world works. I call this the symbolic worldview because it's based on personification, as Biko had said, and the idea that these personified entities are trying to communicate to us by means of symbols. And so the rainstorm is not just a rainstorm, it's a symbol that the rain god is not happy with us, or something like that. And then, so basically, religion comes into existence when all of this is going on, takes this into its fold, and delivers worldviews in terms of this type of understanding. Because of the discovery, I guess, of writing and the developments in writing, as I said, that led up to the alphabet, we have a transition in thinking where some people want to start expressing themselves in more literal languages, and I'll wrap it up here real quick. And so we see the advent of science, and within a generation there's a reaction to that, which is the advent of philosophy. And so they start developing a more literal grammar and develop the ideas of, for instance, causality and analogy in science. So in a sense, imitative magic, which is based on analogy, turns into analogy in science, and contagious magic, which is based on metonymy, turns into causality in science. And so there's the transition from the old ways into basically what we call the new ways. But to get to the point here, and to end up quickly, what we're left with are basically two general types of worldviews. And it's not as if when the new worldview comes into, or type of world comes into existence, the old one disappears. There is still, as a matter of fact, I think most people are more connected to their religious worldview than they are to the scientific and rational worldview. And so both of these exist side by side. And as a matter of fact, my talk here, my presentation is entitled Straddling Worldviews. But after listening to some of the people here earlier today, I was thinking maybe it should be something like Balancing Worldviews. Because the point I try to make to my students is that I don't know which of these is the correct way of looking at the world, and I don't think that either one is the correct way of looking at the world. They're just two different ways of looking at the world that we have understood, we have developed. And many people use actually both of them. In fact, part of the reason I came up with my students seem to be perplexed sometimes because they're living in both of these worlds. They have a fairly rich religious upbringing in their youth, but they're also, of course, going through the public school system where they're getting the rational worldview. And this does lead to certain problems, and that's what I want to address. Of course, I'll do that quickly here. One of the main problems I was thinking about is a gentleman, there was James Arthur Ray, who was a self-proclaimed self-help guru who would get a lot of people together and try to inspire them to change. And one of his ideas, his main ideas was that like attracts like. So if you want a Mercedes-Benz, you have to act like a person who owns a Mercedes-Benz, and you will get that. And so he gets all these people under this spell of the sort of magical way of thinking and gets them into a sweat lodge in Arizona somewhere, and 3 people end up dying because he's basically misusing two different parts of different parts of these two different worldviews. He's mixing them up, and the poor people who are paying $10,000 to attend these ceremonies are also not in a position to understand this. That was the main problem I want to address. But after listening to people here, I also realized that and that's one thing I like about this particular association, it does embrace people who are of a scientific bent or people who are of a religious bent. And of course the people who are of either of these bent are not necessarily purely scientific or purely religious. We are in a sense balancing these two different types of worldviews, and I think the main idea here is neither one of these is the correct way of understanding the world. It's just means for us to make our way in the world, and I think both of them are useful in their sense, in a sense, in the right place. It's just finding that right place that I think is problematic at this time. And I'm sorry for taking up too much going over there, but